What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to another Fire Emblem Engage video. If you enjoy this content, please help support the channel by leaving a like and consider subscribing so you can see the latest reviews of Nintendo content and more Fire Emblem content in the future. With the final wave of Fire Emblem Engage's DLC having been released a little over a month ago, it has given me enough time to digest the interesting piece of content that is the Fell Xenologue. I played through the Fell Xenologue twice in this past month, and my impressions changed from the first playthrough to the second. A little disclaimer before I go any further is that I did not like this DLC at all. My opinion on this DLC isn't as harsh as other content creators, but for the record, I did not enjoy a good portion of it because of a variety of things that I'll discuss later. So, before I get attacked by people in the comments saying things like, at least it's better than the main game, or what made this DLC work was its edginess and its twist, please note that although I understand those are aspects that make FX what it is, FX has so many other issues with its story and gameplay that its good aspects are overshadowed by the bad, making it an absolute dumpster fire of a story expansion. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Fell Xenologue. Oh my gosh, Fell Xenologue is so edgy. It makes me feel like I'm back in my middle school edgelord days. No, you want to know what is edgy? You want to know what true Fire Emblem edginess is? Remember what happened to our boy Dimitri in literally every single story path of Three Houses? That is edgy. The Fell Xenologue story pales in comparison to the only other classic Fire Emblem game on Switch, Three Houses. Yes, I know FX is just a DLC while Three Houses is a full game, but we can't forget the amazing story that was Three Houses. Also, the Cindered Shadows DLC was better than Fell Xenologue by a long shot. Engage standing alone was a fun playthrough, but mostly because I enjoyed the new gameplay mechanics that the game held. The story was largely dull, and it was difficult for me to become invested. That is until our MC dies, then I got excited thinking what cool mechanic was going to happen next without a main character, but then Vale and the Emblems had to ruin everything. I'm looking at you, Marth. Compared to the disappointing story of the base game, I do have to say that after playing through FX a second time, that its story is a little bit more substantial, but not by much. Like probably about as much as the deployment percentage of Vander Chapter 8 of the base game. The second time through, I knew what to expect, so I wasn't setting a bar that the game consistently fell under during my first run. The ideas that the writers implemented are fantastic, which is that the base game is about over-the-top teamwork makes the dream work and the power of friendship. But the DLC is dark and gloomy and dreary, like all my friends are dead and the only person who I trust is me. The two stories sit at such opposing extremes that it is clear as to what the writers wanted to say when making FX. This trope is perfect for a Mirrorverse DLC, and given a little bit of extra work, could have become an amazing expansion to Engage. But even though their aim was clear, the story just didn't live up to previous installments of Fire Emblem. My biggest qualm is what they did to the previous lords, because once the MC enters the alternate world, it is heavily driven into the player and main character that the people in this world aren't the same as in theirs. They may share similarities, they may share likenesses, but they aren't the same people. The fact that we can deploy our own units into battle against their mirror counterparts is cool and interesting, but it makes the deaths of these alternate lords and characters less impactful and meaningful than it should have been. We aren't getting attached to the alternate world's characters because we aren't given the opportunity to. The story feels very rushed in that sense. And yes, I know it's only 6 chapters, but they could have made the story longer so they could flesh out some of their bearer points, like how everyone but the 4 hounds turned corrupted. Even if the story was shorter than it already is, and was focusing on just the lords becoming evil after Ylir's death, would have been totally fine if they gave a good short story that explains what was going on. I think that would have been much better than a story 6 chapters long trying to cover all of this story and stuff and not being able to follow through with it. And the other story aspect that flopped for me was about Nil. Nil's betrayal is the twist that got everyone excited, but I was sitting in chapter 2 thinking, wow, this dude sucks. There's no way we would have to force deploy a unit as bad as this, unless he's trying to be the cool OP sibling and hide his true OP power so he can try to backstab his sister. The most excited I was during the entire FX came 3 chapters later when I found out I was right. When they revealed Nil is evil, I was excited, which is what the story was trying to do, but following the discovery is a frustrating battle in chapter 5 where you are locked into using optimal units depending on their locked class types and whatever units you have invested large amounts of SP in. I already had units I dumped my SP into, so I used them only to find out that the setup I chose was getting swamped by the enemy reinforcements, forcing me to exit the series of battles I was in and build units that could combat these enemies because of the forced lock on class types and unit items. The gameplay made it so much more frustrating. But anyways, back to the story. The twist was interesting, but it isn't like the twist wasn't blatantly obvious from the get-go. The twist was also delivered in such a way that it carried the rest of the story because as it was the last piece of interest before the story ended, as a result, players who saw the twist coming were able to predict how FX was going to end, which spoiled the fun of the twist surprise and created a boring story, but at least that's how it was for me. This also means that any attempt at a rerun creates a slog of a story because we already know what happens and we already know the twist is there, and with boring gameplay and a boring story, the game is a slog. The DLC isn't that good. But even though the story sucked, it wasn't all that bad because it did provide cool mirrorverse dialogue between your units and the enemies. The message of the story, which is hopelessness, was interesting to play through and to see how Elyos faces it when in the base game, the message is hopefulness. The base game and DLC sit at opposite ends, making their clash very interesting to see and fun to experience. Playing in a mirror world and facing your previous allies with your former enemies was very fun, but the game heavily relied on players' hopes of wanting to see what it would be like to play as the 4 hounds versus the lords of the base game. And the story didn't really offer much else, which is disappointing because the new characters weren't interesting and were kind of bland. They weren't able to bring much to the table. And I wouldn't be this critical of any DLC because I don't think the DLC holds the same potential as any full story. But FX failed in not only its storytelling, but also its gameplay, neither of which added to the base game. So it doesn't win in any regards. That gameplay was awful, guys. I am sorry, but I was getting ready to use Sage Anna to wipe the floor with some corrupted wolves, only to find out she's a base class axe fighter, and all of my investment was thrown in the trash. Not being able to use characters and classes that you decide is the biggest downfall of this DLC, especially since they introduced 2 new classes that are only available once you beat the entire story of FX, and also they don't allow you to use any of those classes during the story of FX, even in repeat playthroughs. Being locked into the units the game wants you to use provides added difficulty, but since the DLC implements more than just this as added difficulty, this unit lock is simply frustrating. With so many games offering content geared towards a player's choice and giving the player almost unlimited potential when playing the game, this DLC feels very restricting, in the sense that the only things the player is able to customize is the units they deploy and the skills the units have inherited. It seems like a step back. And by the time the players are able to play the DLC, they either haven't unlocked the full roster of units and don't have enough SP to mess around with, or are at the end of their playthrough already having invested in various class changes, emblem bond levels, and inherited skills that may be rendered useless by the DLC. Not only is being locked into using pre-made units frustrating, we are also forced to use the 4 winds, who are only good for baiting enemy units. The game gives them items that have low hit rate at higher levels. Instead of being able to choose between iron and steel weapons, we are forced into using silver weapons which have lower hit rates, and we are forced into this when the enemy's avo rates are increasing rapidly, which makes trying to land a single hit on an enemy very frustrating. Fire Emblem is about tactics and strategy, but when they take away every bit of tactic and strategy and leave us with trying our best to make do with what we were given, it doesn't feel like a game, it feels like a chore. I wasn't happy or excited when I beat Chapter 5. I was relieved. I was like, that sucked. I don't want to experience that again, ever. I mean, but I did play through it again. Man, I need to see a therapist or something. Dimitri, what are you doing here? The characters we were given were Nell, Nil, Celestia, Gregory, and Madeline. No Mavir since we already had a Mavir at home, which for once I'm thankful for using my at-home Mavir because the FX units suck. No wonder they ultimately fell into despair and hopelessness. Nell was a decent unit, but was only useful due to her dragon type, which meshed well with every emblem ring because it gave her special bonuses. But since her, Nil, and the 4 winds can't gain any bond levels, they're only able to utilize emblem skills at bond level 1, which effectively crushes any hopes of making these new units useful. Combined with their awful base stats, forced class selection, no ability to inherit skills, and set items, these new units are hindrances and only become useful as enemy bait or during Chapter 5 when they aren't there. The difficulty of the DLC was very frustrating. They locked our units with set weapons and classes and forced us to deploy units that couldn't even hit enemy units a large portion of the time, leaving us with units that we built during the base game. And those became obsolete if we built them incorrectly. Because if our unit we built during the base game wasn't in the same class as the one in the DLC, sucks for us, because now we have to go at the DLC with a unit that won't survive for long, or go back to the base game and grind for SP on that unit so we can build an optimal unit with the classes the DLC forces on us. I just want to say this because I'm sure everyone is thinking about it now, but nobody likes grinding for SP. It is probably the most boring thing I have ever done, and especially when we already have units who have amazing builds like High Priest Sage Anna or Crit Monster Linden. It is annoying to have to change their builds to play a single chapter of DLC. We also have to upgrade bond levels with units and the emblem rings because a large majority of the units we deploy we can't make full use of because the emblem rings we put on them we haven't deployed very often in the base game or paired them with that particular emblem before. The only thing that I think FX did particularly well was their map design and enemy strategies. I think that the way they designed chapters 4 and 5 were especially cool. The concept of strategy in both of these chapters were also done very well. Chapter 4 was an all-out war between Elusia and Solm with a ginormous map. Being a third party in that battle between these two powerhouses and trying to sneak around the map to try and take out Tamara and Ivy, only to get discovered and have an army of dragons chased after you while you try and defeat Ivy was exhilarating. I enjoyed that time. I enjoyed the time I spent on the map, even with the story and gameplay flaws, simply because I enjoyed the all-out war aspect that this map introduced. And Chapter 5's map was similarly enjoyable, although considerably less due to the bottleneck of enemy reinforcements later in the battle, but being forced to heal Alir while trying to keep Nell alive was fun because it was a literal race against time to save both of them. The strategies the enemy used were interesting as well, where they would group up and congregate around an enchanter so their attacks would be powered up, or the damage dealt by our units would be reflected back to us for a turn. The enemy for sure was difficult in part due to the strategies they used during the battle. These two maps were probably my favorite, but the enjoyment I got from playing these maps was significantly reduced due to this frustrating gameplay mechanics and a bland story. Playing on maddening mode for some of these maps forces players to invest tons of time creating the perfect optimized units for that chapter, or even cheesing the fight entirely, which also takes a ton of time prepping. The maps themselves were interesting, but they could have been so much more if the other aspects of the DLC didn't take out the enjoyment and replace it with frustration and annoyance. Overall, I think FX was decent and provided some enjoyment. It was an okay DLC with a decent story, subpar gameplay, and great map design. I would rate FX as a whole about 5 out of 10. The DLC was mid, so it gets a mid score. FX doesn't have too much replayability since the story is largely based on the surprise factor of Chapter 5, and only the most experienced players or those seeking a challenge are going to replay the DLC for a complete maddening run. FX was disappointing and a sad end to the Engage DLC, especially since other games like Xenoblade 3 had such an amazing DLC that I will be posting a review about soon, which provided content that kept players busy for days. Compared to other franchises in the Nintendo umbrella, Fire Emblem needs to step up its game, even if it wants to compete with games from companies other than Nintendo. Although FX wasn't what we were expecting, I think that the DLC as a whole was a 6.5 out of 10 due to the extra emblems we received. I appreciate seeing the Three Houses trio along with Chrom and Robin. Since Engage itself relies heavily on nostalgia, I think it's fair that the DLC can rely on the same nostalgia factor the base game does. If you guys made it to the end of this video, hit that subscribe button to support my channel so I keep making videos like this in the future, and to stay up to date with the latest from Nintendo. Thank you guys all for watching, and please leave a like and comment what you thought of the Fell Xenologue DLC.